Hey, welcome back, guys. So today should be Monday of the week that I'm gone, whatever that day is in October. And we are going to be looking at the rest of 1776, what's going on with the Continental Army and the British now that we have declared our independence and it's on like Donkey Kong. If y'all don't know that reference, then it's because you're young and also because I'm a nerd. Anyway. All right, so we're going to start off with an old familiar figure, Thomas Paine, T Paine. Remember that in his first pamphlet series called Common Sense, he said that it was common sense for America to separate from Britain. He also laid a basic defense in a very readable, honest language that most American citizens or colonists could understand about why monarchy was a stupid form of government and why a republic would be making common sense. And that proved very instrumental in pushing the colonists and, by extension, the Second Continental Congress towards that Declaration of Independence that we finally um, declared, not on July 4th, but on July 2nd, 1776. What's been happening since then is a lot, actually, because remember, fighting had already developed well before the Declaration of Independence. You had Lexington and Concord in 1775, and you've had the siege of Boston happening. You've had the capturing of, over here on the map, Fort Ticonderoga in upstate New York. And all these things are going down. Now, Washington has been made the commander of the Continental Army. He's not very impressed with his troops. They're very undisciplined, ragtag bunch. And then one of the biggest problems is that they lack supplies. We lack a lot of manufactured goods. Also, a huge issue is that our soldiers are not professional soldiers. They're not being paid also like professional soldiers. So, you get what you pay for there. These are family men. These are fathers and brothers and sons and fiancés. They need to get back to their families. And so their enlistment, the time they were contracted to serve, would expire at the end of the year. So on December 31st, 1776, these soldiers of the Continental Army are going to go home. Washington has a very limited time with which to work with his very undisciplined troops. So all that is going on. You're going to have a situation in Boston where finally, remember, Henry Knox is able to bring those 60 tons of cannons down from Fort Ticonderoga all the way down to Boston over here. And that's going to be put on the Dorchester Heights. And with that strategic advantage, the high ground, with our cannons, pointed right at the city of Boston and the British troop station there, General Howe, Clinton, Burgoyne, they're going to get their butts loaded on ships and go and retreat up to Canada. Because remember, we failed to take Quebec. That failure under Arnold and Montgomery's part. Montgomery, may he rest in peace. And the Continental forces there in Boston allowed Howe to do this so that they could keep the city safe. It's kind of an exchange. You don't torch our city as you're leaving, and we'll let you leave without harassing your troops so they can live to fight another day. Well, now Washington is kind of focused on New York City. He believes, and rightly so, from his intelligence, and Washington was very big on intelligence. Read the book by Alexander Rose, Washington Spies. A lot of spycraft and a lot of great spycraft tactics begins with the American Revolution, and especially around this New York campaign here in the early parts of the war. But Washington believes that the British are going to be focusing on capturing New York City next. And so that's where he is going to march his Continental Army, his newly formed regiments. And again, he's got this mandate on him that he's got to get some victories in. He's got to get some momentum built before the end of the year when their contracts expire. And things are not looking good. Basically, in New York City, just as he thought they would, like 400 British ships show up in the Hudson Bay, in the Hudson Harbor there. And the Continental Army is totally surrounded. The British are taking it easy, camped out on Staten Island. Back then, it apparently wasn't as bad. And the forces under Washington eventually have to retreat to the Harlem Heights, which is where the Harlem neighborhood in New York City is today. So they were in Brooklyn, now they're in Harlem, and then they get cut off again. And basically, each time Washington's having to withdraw and withdraw, he makes blunder after blunder. At one point, when they're crossing the Hudson from Long Island to get back on the mainland for their last final retreat to get the heck out of New York City. Washington was on the very last boat rowing across during the retreat, and the British Army, if it had been just a little bit quicker, they could have actually captured General George Washington and ended the whole thing right there. He was our commander in chief. So Washington, this is going to be repeated frequently, but Washington is always putting himself in harm's way. He believes he's bulletproof. Remember, like during the French Indian War, like during this battle where he has his horse shot out from under him, he has bullets all through his jacket and everything else. This man is not afraid of death, like at all. And he puts himself in harm's way time and time again, basically believing that he is indeed bulletproof. And maybe he was, because there's so many instances where he should have been killed. But so he almost got captured here. Um, Meanwhile, also you have this instance of again spycraft happening in New York City. Washington was desperate for intelligence now that the British are occupying the city on what their new movements were going to be and what they were doing. And a fire broke out. Now, the Continental Congress had told Washington, do not set fire to New York City. Why would Washington have set fire to New York City, you might ask? Well, because now it's in the hands of the British, okay? This is basic, scorched earth policy where you burn your enemy's supplies and leave them with nothing so you can fight this war of attrition against them, and starve them out, basically leave them with nothing. And so Washington doesn't technically burn New York City, but somebody did, as the Continental forces were leaving, and the British go crazy. General Howe has commands out for all patriots in the city to be rounded up and questioned. And one of the young men that they find to be a spy, maybe he didn't set fire to the city, start the fire there, is this young man named Nathan Hale. Nathan Hale, by the way, was good friends with Benjamin Talmadge, who will become the leader of the culprit ring, the spy ring that Washington used to do a lot of his spying during the Revolutionary War. So Nathan Hale is this Continental Army spy from Connecticut for Washington, and he gets hung as a spy would, as a traitor for the crime of espionage. And during his hanging there in front of the British forces and the New York citizens, he famously might have said these words: um, my only regret is that I have but one life to give to my country." So very brave man, Nathan Hale. Anyway, so Washington is forced to run from New York City with his tail between his legs, basically. Retreat after retreat, blunder after blunder. There are a lot of American colonists questioning whether George Washington should be the leader of our Continental Army. Um, and there's a lot of them that are saying maybe we should turn to this guy named Charles Lee. Lee had already successfully fought off the British down when they had tried to do an invasion in South Carolina at Charleston. He was experienced. He certainly thought very highly of himself. If you asked Lee, he would say that he was the best general for the Continental Army. And so Washington is having a tough time of it. And this leads us into the winter now of 1776. But luckily, here comes Thomas Paine. Thomas Paine had been actually going with the soldiers, fighting with them, seeing their struggle, and he writes a new pamphlet now. So he's had Common Sense that came out in 1776. Now, at the end of the year, comes out with another one called The American Crisis, or just sometimes The Crisis. And I'm going to read for you guys the first paragraph to it because it's some very famous words in American history, and it's going to be the reason why a lot of soldiers get a new wind and basically get reinvigorated during this time of, well, crisis. All right, starts off. These are the times the tribe ends souls. The summer soldier and the sunshine patriot will, in this crisis, shrink from the service of his country. But he that stands it now deserves the love and thanks of man and woman. Tyranny, like hell, is not easily conquered. Yet we have this consolation with us that the harder the conflict, the more glorious the triumph. What we obtain too cheap, we esteem too lightly. It is dearness only that gives everything its value. Heaven knows how to set a proper price upon its goods, and it would be strange indeed if so celestial an article as freedom should not be highly rated. Britain, with an army to enforce her tyranny, has declared that she has a right not only to tax, but to bind us in all cases whatsoever. And if being bound in that manner is not slavery, then is there not such a thing as slavery upon earth? Even the expression is impious, for so unlimited a power can only belong to God. So, once again, you see in the crisis, Thomas Paine is using very evocative or emotive language, using simple language, but again, very emotional, to rally the troops of the Continental Army, of the Patriot side. And it will be very successful. Also, interesting in that introduction, you notice he talks about slavery. Thomas Paine himself was very adamantly against slavery. But you do hear this argument often brought up by American colonists and later American citizenry, that they were being enslaved by the British. And later on, like in the lead up to the American Civil War, that the South was being enslaved by tariffs and other things. And yeah, there is a lot of hypocrisy in this notion, of course, when there was actual human slavery happening right under their noses that they didn't seem to acknowledge. But Thomas Paine himself was very against the actual institution of slavery. All right, so good timing, the crisis. We needed that boost. So Washington and his forces are now, they've gone all the way, they've retreated all the way from New York City, all the way down through Jersey, because nobody wants to stay in Jersey, across the Delaware River, and are now camped out in Pennsylvania, kind of as a defensive bulwark to protect Philadelphia, which is now our most important city at this time. And it's where the Continental Congress, remember, our ostensibly our government was meeting. And so that is where he's camped out. Now we find ourselves in December of 1776. Meanwhile, the British troops are going through New York and New Jersey, leisurely at their pace, trying to launch a campaign to win hearts and minds of the colonists. That means they want to try to recruit as many loyalists as possible. Tories, they were called, people who would be loyal to the crown. Remember that like a third of the American colonists were extremely loyal to Britain and to the empire and to the king, George III. And they absolutely did not want any part of this rebellion. Okay. One thing, though, that the British commanders are going to do that are maybe going to cause some of those loyalists to have some doubts, though, are going to be their treatment. Remember, they're constantly going through the countryside in this foreign land because the British are an expeditionary force at this point. They're fighting in a foreign land away from home. They have to rely on these loyalists to get all of their food and supplies. That's putting a huge drain on these people who want to be faithful to the crown. So that's one thing that's really going to turn them off. Another thing is that General Howe and then the British commanders, they're forcing these loyalists and other colonists who were maybe not so loyal to sign these oaths of loyalty to king and country. And nobody wants to be forced to be loyal. You should be loyal out of your own desire. The last thing that was really ticking off colonists here was the presence of the Hessians. Now, you might have heard of the Hessians before. These were German mercenary soldiers that the British had paid for to fight in the American Revolution, thousands of them. The term itself is a little bit misleading, though, because first off, remember that Germany is not yet a country. It doesn't become a country until 1871. And then also, Hessia was one kingdom in the Prussian kingdoms, the many Prussian kingdoms that existed in what will become Germany. There were actually a lot of these German soldiers that were from other kingdoms. And the main export of these kingdoms was warfare. They trained some of the best fighting forces in the world for hire. The other thing why it's misleading is that these German soldiers, we say they're mercenaries. That means a soldier that, works for money, that's getting paid to fight. These Hessian soldiers, they were not getting paid to fight. They were being told to fight. Their kingdom was being paid by the British. So that's who they are. But anyway, they are a foreign force and exceedingly more foreign than like the redcoats, the British soldiers, because at least the British soldiers were more like the colonists. They spoke the same language, they had the same culture. These Hessian forces are speaking German, and they were very, very different, like their sauerkrauts and their beer and their German things. And so having this very alien force, in our backyards that these loyalists were having to support was a big turnoff as well. So this brings us to the battles of Trenton and Princeton in December of 1776 and January of 1777. Real quickly on the map, sorry guys. You're like, no, I was just about to write it. She took it away. I see all spaces when that happens. Sometimes I'll admit I do it just for fun. But anyway, Washington retreated across the Delaware into Pennsylvania. This is the Delaware River that separates New Jersey and Pennsylvania right there. The Battle of Trenton is going to be right there in New Jersey. Battle of Princeton, right behind it. Okay. So those are two very important colonial battles we're about to talk about in this American Revolution. All right. The main British force under General Howe has hunkered down for the winter. Remember that during this time in the 1700s, armies didn't really fight that much in the winter. And they also didn't fight on Christian holidays. That was like just a gentleman's agreement. Washington, he is going to surprise everybody by launching a major offensive with his, uh, let's see, he had about 2,400 soldiers under his command. He is going to have them in rowboats cross the frozen Delaware River from Pennsylvania into New Jersey to lay an attack at Trenton. Trenton is, town in New Jersey. It's where the main force of the Hessians, about um, let's see, about 1,400 Hessian soldiers were camped out at Trenton, and Washington is going to lay this surprise attack on them. He hopes on the night of Christmas when they would least be expecting it. And this famous portrait here, it's called Washington Crossing the Delaware because that's Washington and that's the Delaware River and it's frozen and anyway, probably not too accurate because you wouldn't want to stand like that on the prow of a little rowboat because you would probably fall into that ice and then you would die from hypothermia. But totally awesome, very iconic image from the Revolutionary War. And see, there's the Star Spangled Banner, which I don't believe we even had that flag yet at this point. So there's lots of inaccuracies. Oh my God, look at those horses in that rowboat. Wow, that they did have horses having to be crossed the river in these rowboats. More impressively, well, I don't know, maybe as impressively as the horses being crossed over the river in the rowboats, was that Henry Knox was able to get um, 35 cannons in these rowboats, very heavy pieces of artillery across this frozen river as well. Again, working that magic that he has. And they do this. It was supposed to be at midnight on the night of Christmas. But Washington has a hard time getting all his forces together, and it's super cold. Like it's under 20 degrees Fahrenheit. Frigid, frosty air. There's ice forming and snow coming down, and it's just, I mean, there was like actual ice chunks in the river. So it's very, very bad conditions. So he's not able to actually get them across the river until 4 a.m. when they basically start this thing. And then they have to march 9 miles from the banks of the Delaware over to the town of Trenton, where the Hessian encampment was. And so the only two Americans who were going to die in the Battle of Trenton were actually two of the soldiers that marched those 9 miles from the banks to the town, and they died from exposure. That's when you die from the weather elements. They died from the cold, basically. Remember, like I said, these soldiers are not very well equipped. And they're doing this, by the way, in the end of December 1776, right before their contracts are up. I mean, Washington had made a lot of mistakes at this point, but his ability to motivate his troops here is pretty impressive because these guys are like really close to being able to go home and see their families. And now Washington has somehow convinced them to stare death in the face and go across this frozen river and all this other stuff. Many of the soldiers that did this 9 mile march in the 2 feet of snow, they're doing it with broken shoes or no shoes at all. The ice had torn off parts of the skin on the bottom of their feet, so they were leaving like trails of blood in some of the accounts. Just staggering to think like how lacking his troops were in just basic military equipment and supplies and clothing. But they make it to Trenton, and they do completely surprise these German soldiers that were hired by England, the Hessians. The commander there quickly tries to get his men awake. There is a funny story. I don't think it's too accurate, but it's often told that the Hessians, being good German stock people, they like to drink a lot of beer. It's a German thing. They like to drink a lot of beer, and that they were up late on Christmas night celebrating the holiday because they knew that there wasn't going to be an attack. It was, I mean, it's come on, it's Christmas, and that is why Washington was able to get the drop on them because they were so drunk and hungover. Now that's probably not true. It's more likely that these poor, soldiers for hire that weren't actually getting paid, were actually just, trying not to freeze to death in their tiny tents as they tried to get, a few hours of sleep. And so this complete surprise attack works, and the Hessians are going to surrender. Washington's able to capture about 900 of them. And so this was a huge victory for the colonial forces, and basically George Washington's first victory here at Trenton, New Jersey. So then Washington, knowing that he doesn't have enough forces to take on the larger British detachments that's further up the road at the town of Princeton, decides to double back down to the river. And he stops and makes an encampment on the other side of this creek, an arm of the Delaware called and I'm not making this up, guys, the Assunpink Creek. I can't even make that up. That's like that lake in South America, right? That's called Lake Titicaca. Like I can't make up these names. So yes, Washington and his victorious troops on the heels of their victory at the Battle of Trenton are camping out at Assunpink Creek. And here comes General Cornwallis. You may recognize that name because Cornwallis will later on at the Battle of Yorktown be the British general who basically we accept his surrender at the very last battle of the American Revolutionary War. So he's famous for being the loser here. But General Cornwallis is leading the British detachment, trying to hunt down Washington, hearing about his exploits at Trenton. He's like, "Where's Washington? Let me get him." And he has a much larger force. Well, Washington's going to do something here that he'd actually learned from General Howe during one of his many retreats, trying to get the heck out of New York City as the British kept coming after him and coming after him. The British had tricked Washington by leaving their campfires going in the middle of the night, so that Washington back in New York had thought that the British were still camped where they were because he saw all these lights. But actually, the troops had just left the campfires burning, and then they'd circled around Washington's backside. So Washington is going, turnabout is fair play, right? Washington will do the same thing that the British had done to him here on the banks of the Assunpink River Creek. He will have his men leave lots of campfires going, and he will have a few men stay behind, brave souls, to basically, clink and clank their pots and pans to make it sound like there were a bunch of soldiers still left. And then Washington and his men very, very quietly get out of their encampments and cross the river further up, and then circle back behind General Cornwallis's big British detachments. Now, he still can't fight General Cornwallis. He doesn't have enough men. So, what Washington does is he goes up further the road past Trenton up to Princeton, New Jersey, where there was a smaller British force. And, this important city of Princeton, where the New Jersey College was, which will eventually become Princeton University and all this, and also British weapons supplies there. So Washington is playing some super sneaky, like 4D chess here, doing some awesome stuff, and keeping the British really on their toes. You can just imagine when the morning light shined on that camp, And Cornwallis saw that he'd been duped, just how angry he was at what had happened. And during the Battle of Princeton, where Washington does once again have a superior force, um, and by the way, at this point, he's got 3,900 men. He's going to be reinforced by actual like Marines from American ships. There were 600 Marines that reinforced his troops. This is the first battle in which the Marine Corps is actually going to serve a role. Um, the American troops are going to kill 232 British soldiers at the Battle of Princeton. We will capture 300 British troops, and only 30 something of our guys are killed. So again, this was a solid victory, even bigger than Trenton, here at the Battle of Princeton for George Washington, and that took place on January 3rd, 1777. And then before Cornwallis can get back and beat him, Washington's already gone. He's already disappeared. Washington, by the way, you'll see he's really, really good. Like, he's not going to win a whole lot of battles. Like, he really won't. But Washington was really good at retreating strategically. Okay. I know it sounds like he's, again, not very good, but when you have such a disadvantage against such a much more powerful enemy, you have to play tricky and you have to use what you have. And Washington will eventually come to realize that what he has is this army. He can't, he doesn't have the manpower to hold strategic defense points as you normally would in this type of home field advantage war. But the British cannot claim victory in the American Revolution until Washington and his troops are defeated. So, as long as he keeps his troops moving and he keeps them out of British hands, he's good. And eventually the British will wear down. And that's what happens. And so with that strategy in mind, what Washington does, these amazing strategic retreats are actually like the best thing in many instances that he could have done, just keeping himself and his soldiers out of the British hands. And so, big impact here from the battles of Trenton and Princeton is we got a victory. Finally, we have a victory that we can rest our laurels on. And remember, it could not have come at a better time because so many of these soldiers were about to be going home. Washington had to convince many of his troops just to sign on for another like 6 weeks, so that they could do the Princeton campaign. He was like, "Look, we just beat them at Trenton. If you stay with me for just a few more weeks, we can get Princeton too. I know it." But now that we have these two major victories, and they're going to be reported all throughout the colonial papers, now we have some momentum. Now we're also going to be having these enlistments be renewed as soldiers feel like maybe they're not part of the losing side, and you'll have new enlistments occur as news of this victory spreads. So even though these were small battles, Trenton and Princeton were pivotal. Speaking of a pivotal battle, oh boy, Saratoga. This is the turning point, the big turning point battle of the American Revolutionary War. It's going to take place from September to October of 1777. And Washington actually is going to play no part in this very important battle. This is going to be our General Horatio Gates and also our General Benedict Arnold, who are going to have the big victory here at Saratoga. And this will be the last thing that we talk about in this lecture today. When we talk about a turning point battle, what we mean by that is it's a war that proves pivotal for the winning side to then get the momentum of victory swayed to their side. So this is when the American forces, now they've been losing and losing. Now after Saratoga, it looks like they could actually win this thing. That's why it's a turning point. And what happens is that you have Johnny Burgoyne, the gentleman general, the famous fluffy guy. I say the gentleman general and the fluffy guy because remember he's one of the big three generals that the British send over after all that stuff with Boston. Clinton, Howe, and Burgoyne. Burgoyne was the youngest of the three. He was kind of an upstart. Here's this young guy who's been promoted well ahead of all these other guys. And he was a scholar. He liked to do poems. He didn't like to get his hands dirty. And when he traveled, he liked to travel in style. I'm going to go to the map real quick to explain what's going on, and then I'll go back to the notes. But basically, Burgoyne has been up here in Canada, while Howe's been, up in down here in New York. Clinton's been tooling around and stuff. Basically, the overall British strategy that they had set up, the three generals, was that Burgoyne would take his 9,000 troops down from Quebec, down New York, to basically help get to Albany, and you would have St. Leger, another British general, that would take his forces uh, through the St. Lawrence Seaway to the Great Lakes, and then from the western frontier, attack Albany from the west. So Burgoyne's attacking Albany from the north. St. Leger is attacking Albany, New York from the west. And then you would have General Howe move up from New York and attack it from the south. And once they had Albany, then look, it's a direct way to cut off that very belligerent colony of Massachusetts, because the British, they basically still think at this point, even though there had been battles and fierce bloodshed already down in the South in the Carolinas, the British still believed that New England were the troublemakers, that these Puritans, these colonists up here in New England, if they could be cut off from the rest of the colonies and isolated, then the British could get the colonies to surrender. That's their overall strategy. Unfortunately, Howe has other plans, or he's the experienced old one, and he likes to play it really safe. That's how Washington was able to keep retreating and retreating, because Howe never really pressed his advantage. So Howe is eventually going to be taking Philadelphia. And this is a critical blow to the colonies. This is a critical blow to Washington. We'll talk about in our next lecture what Washington does as a result of this over that winter at Valley Forge. But basically, Howe takes Philadelphia, and he is going to hold that city through the winter. He camps there, and all of his troops are going to be staying in Philadelphia over the autumn and winter of 1777 to 1778. So he doesn't make it up here. Meanwhile, St. Ledger is going to be stopped by Arnold right over here in New York, so he never makes it. So the only one to make it to Albany is Burgoyne. Uh-oh. And about Johnny Burgoyne, like I said, he likes to travel in style. And so he had a baggage train that was at the end of where the soldiers are marching. They would have all these wagons full of their supplies and food and everything. And Burgoyne, his baggage train was exceptionally long, not just for the supplies, but also for his own personal effects. Like he liked to travel with a giant queen size downy feathered bed in one of the wagons, just ridiculous things like that that slowed his troops in their march way down. So he's like very slowly making his way down to Albany. And he is going to get encountered and basically isolated and be forced to surrender here at the Battle of Saratoga because of these blunders, not just on Burgoyne's part, but also from Howe and the defeat of St. Ledger by Arnold. Like I said, the American commander here is Horatio Gates, and Benedict Arnold is going to be one of the big heroes of this turning point. Also, while Burgoyne was very slowly making his way down New York, there was this incident with a loyalist woman who was engaged to one of the soldiers in Burgoyne's troops. Um, oh, Johnny, I'm trying to remember the name of the soldier she was engaged to. Davy Jones. Yeah, not the actual pirate, but David Jones was his name, and I like to think it was Davy Jones. Tragic story, Davy Jones. But anyway, so she's a colonist, but she is loyal to the British, and her fiance is also a colonist. He is loyal to the British and actually fighting for the British, as some colonial troops actually did. They fought in the redcoats against the Patriot colonists, because remember, colonists are kind of divided at this point. And what happens to Jane is that while she's on her way to go reunite with her fiance in Burgoyne's troops, She and her family get attacked by the Native American scouting party that was dispatched by Burgoyne. And Burgoyne was using the Native Americans at this time to frighten the colonists, to basically set them upon the patriot colonists, to convince them, hey, if you want to be with the colonists, you don't have any protection. You should join me. And so this young woman is brutally murdered, and immediately the colonial forces they blame the Native Americans. The British say, well, no, it was maybe a colonial shot that killed her. But regardless, the colonial propaganda is going to be winning here, because they're going to say that Jane McCrane was the most beautiful woman since Helen of Troy, the most virtuous woman since I don't know, the Statue of Liberty hadn't yet been designed, but you get the point. They built her up to be this amazing magical unicorn girl that was tragically and just brutally, killed and maimed and raped and scalped, by these Indians who worked for this British general John Burgoyne. And then to make matters worse, Burgoyne was outraged when he found out what had happened to one of his soldiers' fiancées. And so he goes to his Native American scouts and says, if this is true, I want the native who killed this young woman brought forward, and he's going to be executed. And the natives were like, yeah, we're not going to do that, because if you make us do that, we're all going to leave you. And so Burgoyne doesn't really push the issue. He lets them basically get away with this. And so that also makes the propaganda worse. And all throughout the papers, in the colonial press, they were using this instance of Jane McCrae's death to basically spur recruitment. And there would be a lot of people, both loyalists and the people who are on the fence, that are going to turn to the Patriots' side just because of this instance. Um, so that is Jane McCrae's sad fate. So Burgoyne, he gets caught. His baggage train gets separated. You're going to have Daniel Morgan and the Virginia boys laying fire into his forces and keeping at bay. And for like 17 days, they're kind of in a stalemate as both sides, um, Gates and Arnold on one side, and Burgoyne and his forces on the other side, are kind of like, do we want to do this? But luckily, the Americans seized the advantage, knowing that Burgoyne was basically on his own. And like I said, Daniel Morgan, remember he was up in Quebec and he got captured, now he's freed. Him and his Virginia boys are exceptionally important here. They take out one of the up and coming best British generals, General Fraser, basically with sniping. Um, the Virginia boys were really good with their rifles. They could snipe from the woods from hundreds and hundreds of paces away at long range, and that kept the British from being able to advance and probably take a victory. And they kept them at bay for weeks, basically, for over 2 weeks. They kept them at bay through sniping from the woods, and they kept killing, just like at the Battle of Bunker Hill. They kept targeting British officers, which really cut into British morale. At one point during a critical juncture, um, General Gates has ordered the Americans to fall back, and Benedict Arnold comes charging in against Gates' orders, basically saying, come on, men, and rallying his troops, and on horseback, leading them into battle at the front of the regiment, to take the British troops on the field. And Arnold will be shot in the leg, the same leg that he'd injured during the unsuccessful siege of Quebec. And the leg will basically be, it'll leave him with a severe limp for the rest of his life. They never quite are able to fix his leg after this. But Arnold, for sure, absolutely proved critical to the American victory here at the Battle of Saratoga. And then finally, on October 17th, 1777, you have General Johnny Burgoyne surrendering to the American general Horatio Gates with his, the remains of his 9,000 troops, a major British army surrendering for the first time to a colonial force. And this is a very significant deal. This proves that the Americans are capable of defeating the British, even in major battles. This is enough of, a an example, I guess, to get critical European powers to start to support the American cause. And the most significant of these are going to be the French support that we're going to get from this. So it's because of the Battle of Saratoga that France will enter on our side. Because remember, France and Britain have been at war for generations and generations. The Hundred Years' War, the 30 Years' War, the French and Indian War, the 7 Years' War. Um, all of these where the British and the French have constantly been at each other's throats. The French wanted to enter on our side, but not if we were going to be, a losing cause. Battle of Saratoga proves that we could be winners. Now France is going to help us out. And with France, oh, thank goodness. Now we finally have artillery, we have a navy, we have professional, disciplined troops. We're going to get all kinds of support now that France can officially join on our side. Okay, that's for another day. So we're going to stop there today. I appreciate it, guys. And remember to keep working on your song project. I'm looking forward to those. If you make it funny, ironic, serious, use props, you could talk to Mr. Price. He has in the past been very helpful and willing to let my students, if you just ask him and tell him what it's for, use his costumes. They have some time period appropriate costumes you could look into. But yeah, please be working on your song projects and don't forget your reading quiz. All right. Thank you guys. I'll talk to you later. Bye.